Before we begin, remember, history isn't always written by governments. Sometimes it's written in blood. What you're about to hear is the untold story of how the Cosa Nostra built an invisible empire inside America itself. If you love uncovering the truth behind power, fear, and corruption, make sure to subscribe, turn on notifications, and join our community of truth seekers. Every week we expose another secret that history tried to bury. Don't just watch, investigate with us. The story of the Cosa Nostra's arrival in America begins not with a gunshot or a blood pact, but with the slow whisper of desperation that traveled across the Atlantic. At the turn of the 20th century, thousands of Sicilian immigrants crowded the ports of Palermo, Messina, and Naples, fleeing poverty, hunger, and a corrupt system that had long oppressed them. They sought freedom, work, and dignity in a new world that promised opportunity, America. But among the honest workers and families chasing dreams, there were others who carried something darker in their hearts. The ancient codes of the Sicilian Mafia, born in the shadow of feudal violence and distrust. They didn't just bring their traditions, they brought a system of silence, loyalty, and control that would soon take root in the streets of New York. When those ships docked at Ellis Island, the American dream collided with a harsh reality. Immigrants were forced into overcrowded neighborhoods, living in conditions not unlike the ones they had escaped. In the narrow alleys of Little Italy, power became survival, and survival required protection. This was where the seeds of organized crime began to grow. Small gangs formed to protect their communities from exploitation, but that protection came with a price: obedience. In those early years, crime and necessity became inseparable, and the Mafia found fertile ground in a nation that still didn't understand its enemy. One of the first names to emerge from the shadows was Giuseppe Morello, known as the Clutch Hand. Morello was no ordinary immigrant. He was a visionary of crime. By 1900, he had already built an underground empire in East Harlem, running counterfeiting operations and extortion rings that terrified local merchants. He introduced the American underworld to a concept that had long existed in Sicily, the idea of a secret brotherhood bound by blood and silence. His men swore oaths of loyalty not to money, but to the family, a sacred bond sealed with ritual and death. Those who betrayed the code faced a fate worse than prison. They simply disappeared. As the decades passed, the Sicilian way of life began to merge with the brutal realities of American urban crime. Prohibition, introduced in 1920, became the Mafia's golden opportunity. When the US government banned alcohol, the Mafia didn't just smuggle whiskey, it smuggled power. Bootlegging turned street thugs into millionaires overnight, and their influence spread from New York to Chicago, from the docks of New Orleans to the gambling dens of Detroit. Violence was their language, and corruption was their passport. Politicians, police officers, and businessmen all had a price, and the Mafia knew exactly how to pay it. What made the Mafia different from other criminal groups wasn't just its violence, it was its structure. The Sicilians had perfected a system that mirrored legitimate business, complete with hierarchies, codes, and strategies. At the top stood the boss, or Don, a figure both feared and respected. Beneath him were the underboss, caporegimes, soldiers, and associates, a pyramid of loyalty that ensured power flowed only upward. It was, in essence, a shadow government, invisible yet omnipresent, with its own rules and enforcement mechanisms. This structure allowed them to operate across state lines and avoid detection by law enforcement for decades. The Mafia didn't need to conquer cities with armies. They conquered them through loyalty, intimidation, and silence. By the 1920s, names like Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano dominated headlines, their violent feud later known as the Castellamarese War. It wasn't just a fight for territory, it was a battle for the soul of the Mafia itself. Between the old Sicilian ways and a new, more modern vision of organized crime, the war left bodies scattered across New York, each killing a message carved in blood. It was during this chaos that a young, cunning gangster named Charles Lucky Luciano began to rise. He understood what others didn't, that the mafia's survival depended on evolution. Luciano would soon end the old world of vendettas and bring order to the underworld, but that revolution was still to come. For now, America was learning a hard truth. The mafia wasn't just a foreign import, it was an organism that adapted perfectly to the American environment. Corruption found a home in democracy's cracks, and greed became its most effective weapon. As factories boomed and the economy grew, so did organized crime. Construction companies, unions, and even local governments fell under mafia influence. Immigrants who once worked as dock laborers or street vendors became made men, wielding more power than any city official. Fear kept everyone in line, and the code of omerta, the sacred vow of silence, ensured that even when everyone knew who the killers were, no one ever spoke. The media tried to sound the alarm. Newspapers from the 1910s to the 1930s published stories of mysterious murders, disappearances, and raids that never seemed to lead anywhere. But the mafia wasn't a ghost. It was a system. It didn't hide in the shadows because it didn't need to. It existed in the open, dressed in suits, shaking hands with mayors, priests, and bankers. Its strength came not from violence alone, but from respect, or rather, the fear that disguised itself as respect. To challenge them meant death. To work with them meant safety. And so, city by city, neighborhood by neighborhood, America's criminal underworld was quietly conquered by Sicilian order. By the end of the 1920s, the silent invasion was complete. What had begun as a migration of the poor had transformed into a migration of power. The mafia had learned to speak the language of America. Not English, but money. Their control reached deep into the country's veins, from the ports that moved its goods to the streets that sold its dreams. The line between legality and crime blurred until it nearly disappeared. Judges were bribed, police officers were bought, and politicians were puppets on invisible strings. The Cosa Nostra had arrived, and it wasn't leaving. The story of their rise wasn't just a tale of blood and greed. It was the story of how America's hunger for opportunity created the perfect storm for corruption to thrive. The mafia didn't invade the United States with guns. It invaded with promises, protection, profit, and power. And in the land of the free, those promises were all too tempting. By the time the nation realized what had happened, the shadow of Sicily was already too deep to erase. The Cosa Nostra had become part of America itself, its invisible empire built not on ideals, but on fear. And from that darkness, an empire of terror was born. By the early 1930s, the streets of New York had become a war zone. Bodies were turning up in alleys, dumped in rivers, or found slumped behind steering wheels, faces unrecognizable from shotgun blasts. The city was bleeding under the weight of the Castellamarese War, a ruthless conflict between two powerful Sicilian factions led by Joe, the boss, Masseria, and Salvatore Maranzano. What began as a fight for control over rackets and territories soon turned into something more profound, a civil war for the very future of organized crime in America. And in the chaos of blood and betrayal, a young gangster named Charles Lucky Luciano saw an opportunity to build something far greater than either side could imagine, an empire. Luciano was different. Born in Sicily, but raised in the harsh streets of New York's Lower East Side, he'd learned early that survival was about more than brutality. It was about intelligence. He was pragmatic, fluent in the languages of both the old world and the new. While others fought over tradition and territory, Luciano was thinking about business, about structure, about a system that could endure beyond any one man's reign. He despised the old-world codes that made men like Masseria cling to feudal notions of loyalty and bloodline. To Luciano, crime wasn't personal, it was profit, and to achieve it, he needed allies, not soldiers. That's when he found his first true partner, Meyer Lansky. Lansky wasn't Sicilian, and under mafia rules, that alone should have disqualified him. But Luciano didn't care. Lansky was brilliant, a mathematical mind, wrapped in the calm demeanor of a banker. Together, they saw what the traditionalists could not. That crime in America could be organized like a corporation. The mafia could be a business empire, one that controlled gambling, liquor, prostitution, and labor through precision and strategy, not superstition and revenge. It was a vision that required breaking every rule that had defined the mafia for centuries. The turning point came in 1931. Luciano, pretending loyalty to both warring bosses, played them against each other. He knew that as long as the old guard ruled, progress was impossible, so he made a decision that would change the underworld forever. In April of that year, he invited his mentor, Joe Masseria, to a quiet lunch at a Coney Island restaurant. When the check came, Luciano excused himself to the restroom, and as he walked away, his men entered. Bugsy Siegel, Vito Genovese, and Albert Anastasia unleashed a storm of bullets that left Masseria dead on the floor, a playing card still in his hand. The old boss was gone, and Luciano had cleared the first obstacle on his path to power. But one tyrant was quickly replaced by another. Maranzano declared himself the boss of bosses, demanding tribute from every crime family in America. Luciano knew that nothing had truly changed. The mafia was still bound by outdated traditions that would eventually destroy it. So, only a few months later, he struck again. In September 1931, Maranzano was lured into his Manhattan office for what he believed was a meeting with accountants. Instead, 4 gunmen disguised as federal agents burst in and shot him to death. In one calculated stroke, Luciano ended the era of Sicilian feudalism and ushered in the modern American mafia. With the old guard buried, Luciano began to rebuild. He abolished the title of boss of bosses, declaring that no single man should rule over others. Instead, he created the Commission, a governing council of the most powerful mafia families, designed to mediate disputes, regulate territories, and prevent the kind of destructive wars that had nearly destroyed them. Each family had autonomy, but was bound by a collective interest, profit. Violence was no longer the first resort, it was the last. The mafia had evolved from a disorganized band of killers into a disciplined corporate empire. The Commission's influence spread quickly. Luciano aligned himself with Frank Costello, Joe Adonis, and Lansky, while allowing other ethnic groups, Irish, Jewish, and even some black syndicates, to operate under his umbrella for a share of profits. It was an unprecedented move. The American underworld was no longer divided by ethnicity. It was united by money. Gambling operations thrived in Florida and Cuba. Narcotics routes opened from Europe to Harlem, and prostitution rackets became industrial-scale enterprises. The mafia had become a multinational enterprise decades before the term even existed. But Luciano's genius was not just in organization, it was in vision. He understood that for the mafia to survive, it had to operate not in opposition to society, but within it. He bribed politicians, funded judges' campaigns, and paid off law enforcement. Through the unions, particularly the longshoremen and the Teamsters, the mafia gained control over the arteries of the American economy, the ports, the trucks, the shipments, the goods. Nothing moved without their approval. To the public, it was invisible. To those inside, it was absolute power. Meyer Lansky, operating behind the scenes, handled the financial empire. He laundered illegal profits through legitimate businesses and casinos, especially in Havana and later Las Vegas. Together, Lansky and Luciano turned mob money into legitimate capital, reinvested in construction, entertainment, and real estate. In a chilling sense, they blurred the line between crime and capitalism so effectively that the two became indistinguishable. Their success was proof that the mafia no longer needed to operate from the shadows. It could thrive in daylight, wearing suits and shaking hands with senators. Yet even as Luciano reigned, the seeds of his downfall were already sown. Law enforcement had begun to change. Under President Roosevelt, a young prosecutor named Thomas Dewey targeted Luciano with relentless precision. Using testimony from prostitutes and corrupt officers, Dewey built a case that portrayed Luciano as the architect of a vast prostitution network. In 1936, Luciano was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. His empire, however, didn't crumble. It adapted. From behind bars, Luciano continued to direct operations, using Lansky as his voice on the outside. The world soon changed again with the outbreak of World War II. Fearing sabotage on American docks, the U.S. Navy secretly reached out to Luciano, still imprisoned, to ensure cooperation and security along New York's waterfront, a mission later known as Operation Underworld. In exchange for his assistance, his sentence was commuted, and in 1946, he was deported to Italy. From there, he continued to influence the mafia's global network until his death. Even in exile, his presence lingered across continents, a ghost who had redefined organized crime. Luciano's legacy was undeniable. He had turned chaos into order, brutality into business, and criminal ambition into an institution that would endure for generations. The mafia he built wasn't just a gang. It was an empire governed by rules, hierarchy, and profit. The blood that had been spilled in the streets of New York gave birth to a system that would spread across America, from Chicago to Los Angeles, and eventually into politics, unions, and corporations. The Empire of Terror was no longer a collection of criminals. It was a nation within a nation, and it owed its birth to the blood pact between two men, Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky. Together they transformed the mafia from a collection of outlaws into one of the most powerful organizations in modern history, proving that in America, even crime could be industrialized. By the time the dust settled after Lucky Luciano's revolution, America was already divided, not by geography or politics, but by power. From the neon streets of New York to the smoke-filled alleys of Chicago and the rising desert oasis of Las Vegas, the mafia's influence stretched like an invisible web over the nation. What had started as street-level racketeering was now a parallel system of governance. Cities didn't just have mayors and councils, they had dons. Laws weren't just written in courtrooms, they were enforced in backrooms, with cash-stuffed envelopes and the silent threat of violence. America, in all its modern glory, had quietly become a kingdom ruled by men no one voted for, but everyone feared. In New York, the five families, Genovese, Gambino, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Colombo, reigned supreme. Each controlled its own territories, businesses, and labor unions, bound together by the commission that Luciano had created. The docks, construction sites, and garbage industries were all under mafia control. A simple building project in Manhattan could not move forward unless the families approved it. If you wanted your trucks unloaded, your union protected, or your contracts signed, you paid the price, not in paperwork, but in tribute. The mafia's presence wasn't seen, it was felt, like the hum of electricity through the veins of the city. One of the most powerful figures to emerge during this era was Frank Costello, the so-called Prime Minister of the underworld. Unlike the brutish gangsters of the past, Costello operated with the sophistication of a Wall Street executive. He preferred suits to bullets, influence to fear. Through political connections and control of the Tammany Hall machine, Costello infiltrated the highest levels of New York's government. Judges, police chiefs, and city officials became extensions of the mafia's will. Under his guidance, organized crime became organized governance. Meanwhile, in Chicago, a different kind of empire was being built. one soaked in blood and whiskey. The Prohibition years had transformed the city into a battlefield, and at the center of it all stood Al Capone. Though Capone's reign predated Luciano's commission, his methods laid the blueprint for territorial domination. With an army of gunmen, he controlled the city's breweries, speakeasies, and brothels. Violence wasn't just a tool, it was a message. The infamous St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929, where 7 of Capone's rivals were gunned down in broad daylight, shocked the nation. But it also solidified his rule. Chicago had learned that resistance was suicide. After Capone's fall, the outfit, Chicago's Mafia, evolved under men like Frank Nitti and Tony Accardo. They traded the Tommy guns for ledgers, the massacres for manipulation. The outfit became an empire of unions, controlling the Teamsters under Jimmy Hoffa. With the Teamsters' pension funds at their disposal, billions of dollars flowed into Mafia-approved ventures. They could fund casinos, buy politicians, and silence anyone who stood in their way. The corruption wasn't local, it was national. Senators took donations, judges looked away, and labor leaders became pawns. Chicago's mob didn't just rule a city, it owned a country. And then came Las Vegas, the Mafia's final masterpiece. What was once a dusty patch of desert in Nevada became the symbol of organized crime's evolution from blood to business. The dream began with Bugsy Siegel, the charismatic gangster who envisioned a paradise of gambling, glamour, and greed. In 1946, he opened the Flamingo Hotel, a luxurious casino financed through mob money funneled from the East Coast. Siegel's vision was grand, but his management was reckless. He overspent, angered his investors, and soon found himself on the wrong side of mafia economics. On June 20th, 1947, Siegel was shot to death in Beverly Hills, his body riddled with bullets, his dream left bleeding on the carpet. But the Mafia didn't mourn him. They simply took over his empire. Through the 1950s and 1960s, Las Vegas became a goldmine for organized crime. Families from Chicago, New York, and Kansas City all had stakes in the casinos. They skimmed millions off the books, laundering money through hotel accounts and offshore banks. What looked like a glamorous entertainment industry was, in truth, a criminal operation run with surgical precision. The desert glittered under neon lights, but beneath it flowed a river of stolen cash and fear. Every card flipped, every slot machine spun, paid tribute to the families that built the city's foundations on corruption. The government eventually took notice. In 1957, a small-town police raid in Appalachian, New York, accidentally exposed the Mafia's national network. More than 60 mobsters from across the country were arrested at a rural estate during what was supposed to be a secret commission meeting. The event shocked America, proof that the Mafia wasn't just a local myth, but a national reality. Yet, even after the headlines faded, little changed. The Mafia's grip was too deep, its influence too broad. It had infiltrated every layer of society: construction, waste management, labor, entertainment, and politics. To dismantle it meant dismantling the very systems America depended on. For ordinary citizens, the Mafia was both protector and predator. Shop owners in Brooklyn paid for protection, not out of choice, but out of survival. Truck drivers, waiters, and factory workers owed their jobs to mob-controlled unions. Even Hollywood wasn't immune. Studios made quiet deals to avoid labor strikes or distribution problems. The Mafia didn't just control crime, it controlled opportunity. If you wanted to succeed, you had to play by their rules. And yet, the illusion persisted, the illusion of safety, of order. To many, the Mafia represented something perversely admirable: power without politics, justice without law. They punished thieves, kept neighborhoods clean, and ensured loyalty among their own. It was the paradox of organized crime, that within its terror lay a strange kind of stability. Cities under siege learned to live in that tension, to accept that peace came at a price. By the 1960s, the mafia's influence had become so normalized that many Americans barely noticed it anymore. Politicians attended banquets alongside known mobsters. Celebrities mingled with capos in Las Vegas lounges. The mob's reach extended into television, unions, even law enforcement itself. The line between criminal and citizen blurred until it nearly disappeared. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Federal prosecutors, led by figures like Robert F. Kennedy, began to dig deeper. Surveillance, wiretaps, and the rise of the FBI's organized crime division slowly peeled back the illusion. For the first time, the mafia's internal world, its rules, rituals, and betrayals, began to see daylight. Yet even as the law closed in, the families adapted. They always did. Because by then, America was already theirs. From the skyscrapers of Manhattan to the casinos of Nevada, the mafia's empire was woven into the nation's fabric, invisible, untraceable, and devastatingly effective. The siege wasn't a battle fought with guns. It was one fought with money, silence, and fear. And for decades, the mafia won. By the mid-20th century, the mafia had achieved what no criminal organization in American history had ever dared to imagine. It had infiltrated the political bloodstream of the nation itself. It no longer needed to hide behind alleyway gunfights or bootleg trucks. Its members wore tailored suits, attended charity galas, shook hands with senators, and made campaign donations that opened doors once reserved for the country's elite. The Cosa Nostra had discovered that in America, the true power wasn't in bullets, it was in influence, and influence could be bought, shaped, or silenced. In New York, the mafia's 5 families had already conquered the streets, but now they wanted more. Access to the city's arteries, its ports, unions, construction projects, and above all, politics. The genius of this strategy lay in its subtlety. The mafia didn't need to overthrow the government, it only needed to bend it quietly. A permit delayed, a zoning plan approved, a labor strike resolved. These were the moments where organized crime and public office intertwined. Politicians didn't always realize they were dealing with mobsters. Some did. Many didn't care. Frank Costello, known to the press as the Prime Minister of the Underworld, was one of the first to perfect the art of political corruption. During the 1930s and 1940s, Costello controlled an empire that stretched from illegal gambling operations to influence inside Tammany Hall, New York's infamous democratic political machine. He didn't rule through fear alone, he ruled through favors. Judges, police captains, and city councilmen owed him their positions. When he called, they answered. When he whispered, laws changed. He famously said, "I don't want to be the boss of crime. I want to be the boss of everything." And for a time, he was. Through Tammany Hall, Costello's network manipulated elections, appointed loyalists to city offices, and secured lucrative contracts for mafia-linked construction companies. If a building went up in Manhattan, a piece of it belonged to the families. If a politician wanted re-election, he went through Costello's channels. The mafia didn't just own the underworld, it had bought itself a seat at the table of democracy. Across the country, in Chicago, the same pattern emerged. The outfit, descendants of Capone's empire, learned that bribes worked better than bullets. They paid off judges to dismiss cases, police chiefs to look the other way, and aldermen to approve mob-controlled business ventures. Chicago became a laboratory for corruption. The outfit infiltrated the unions that built the city, from steelworkers to truckers, using intimidation and payoffs to control millions in pension funds. These funds were then invested in mafia-friendly enterprises, casinos, nightclubs, construction firms. And when the government occasionally tried to intervene, their reach extended to Washington itself. It was no secret that political campaigns often relied on money from questionable sources. But the mafia's involvement went beyond donations. It became a silent partnership. In return for funding and votes delivered by union blocs, politicians granted protection, or at least indifference, to mob operations. The lines blurred until no one could tell where politics ended and organized crime began. It was an open secret whispered in bars, known by journalists, ignored by the public. America, in its golden age of prosperity, was being built on a foundation of fear and corruption. The 1950s marked a turning point. The Kefauver hearings, led by Senator Estes Kefauver, brought the mafia into the national spotlight for the first time. Televised hearings showed America's most powerful mob figures sitting under bright lights, their faces tight with arrogance or fear, while senators grilled them about their crimes. The public watched, horrified and fascinated, as the veil lifted on the mafia's hidden empire. But the hearings, despite their drama, changed little. The mafia's connections to politicians remained largely untouched. After all, exposing corruption and ending it were two very different things. As Costello's influence waned in the late 1950s, a new generation of mob leaders rose, men like Vito Genovese, who cared less about diplomacy and more about dominance. Yet even Genovese understood that violence without politics was suicide. He, too, cultivated allies in local government and business. His rise coincided with the mafia's expanding control over labor unions, particularly through the International Brotherhood of Teamsters under Jimmy Hoffa. Hoffa's relationship with the mafia would become one of the most infamous alliances in American history, a pact between power and money that reshaped the nation's workforce. The mafia didn't just control workers, it controlled industries, from shipping to trucking to construction. And behind it all, politicians kept smiling for the cameras, pretending not to see. Perhaps the most unsettling element of this era was how deeply the mafia's influence seeped into the justice system itself. Judges were bribed or blackmailed. Grand juries were manipulated. Witnesses vanished. It became common for cases against known mobsters to mysteriously fall apart before trial. Prosecutors grew frustrated and the public grew cynical. The system that was supposed to protect citizens had been hijacked by those who preyed upon them. In this world of shadow deals, the law was both weapon and shield. A bribe could erase a conviction. A favor could open a door. Even the police departments weren't immune. Corruption scandals erupted in major cities, exposing officers who moonlighted as mafia informants or enforcers. In New York, detectives were caught leaking raid information in exchange for cash. In Chicago, entire divisions were rumored to be on the outfit's payroll. The idea of law enforcement had become a bitter irony. The mafia had turned the law into its own instrument of power. By the 1960s, a new kind of fear gripped America. It wasn't the fear of drive-by shootings or gang wars. It was the fear that the enemy was within the system itself. Citizens began to realize that justice could be bought, that crime could wear a suit and sit in Congress. The mafia had achieved what dictators and tyrants only dreamed of. It ruled through legitimacy. It no longer needed to break the law when it could right it. But every empire of corruption carries its own decay. The growing unease reached Washington, where a young attorney general named Robert F. Kennedy declared war on organized crime. His investigations into the Teamsters and the mafia exposed the rot in American politics. Wiretaps, raids, and indictments followed. For the first time, the mafia faced not just exposure, but accountability. Yet even under federal scrutiny, its influence endured. Fear had become law, and fear doesn't vanish with arrests. It lingers, invisible, in the spaces between power and silence. In the end, the Cosa Nostra's greatest weapon was not its guns or its money. It was its understanding of human weakness, greed, ambition, fear. The mafia didn't destroy democracy, it infected it. And for decades, that infection shaped the laws, the unions, and the cities that millions called home. America had always prided itself on being the land of freedom. But during those years, Freedom itself came with a price, one that was negotiated in whispers, paid in envelopes, and signed in blood. By the dawn of the 1960s, the illusion of order within the mafia's empire was beginning to fracture. What had once been an efficient system of business and influence was now teetering on the edge of chaos. The commission, meant to prevent wars, could no longer contain the ambitions of the men who ruled America's underworld. Betrayal was no longer rare. It was currency. And every betrayal demanded a price, paid in blood. The mafia, once a hidden power that prided itself on discretion, erupted into open violence that splattered across newspapers, city streets, and restaurant walls. The age of diplomacy had ended. The age of death had begun. It started, as it often did, with whispers, rumors of disloyalty, greed, and revenge. When Vito Genovese sought to consolidate his control over New York's families, he triggered a chain reaction of paranoia and assassinations. The mafia, now more powerful than ever, was also more vulnerable. Power no longer flowed from respect, it flowed from fear, and fear demanded public demonstrations. Murder became theater, each killing a message, each corpse a signature. In 1957, the killing of Albert Anastasia sent shockwaves through the criminal world. Anastasia, known as the Lord High Executioner, had earned his title as one of the founders of Murder, Inc., the mafia's enforcement arm, responsible for thousands of hits across America. He was a man whose very name evoked terror until the day it became his own undoing. On a crisp October morning, Anastasia walked into the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan for a shave. As he relaxed in the barber's chair, two masked gunmen entered the shop and opened fire. Bullets shattered mirrors and pierced flesh. Anastasia's reflection was the last thing he saw before his body hit the floor. The hit was swift, silent, and symbolic. Even the most feared man in the mafia could be executed mid-shave in a public place, with no one daring to speak a word. It was not just murder, it was a message. No one was untouchable. That message echoed through every borough of New York. Under the surface, alliances shifted like tectonic plates. The Genovese, Gambino, and Lucchese families maneuvered for dominance while pretending unity. The old guard, represented by men like Joe Profaci and Carlo Gambino, sought to maintain order through calculated power plays. But the new generation, hungry, impulsive, and brutal, had no patience for rules. What followed was a series of betrayals so violent and frequent that the mafia's code of silence began to crack under the weight of bloodshed. In 1972, another murder would define the new era: the assassination of Joseph "Crazy Joe" Gallo. Once a rising figure in the Colombo family, Gallo had a taste for rebellion and a flair for the dramatic. He mingled with artists and celebrities, treating mob life like performance art. But his ambition to take over the family made him a target. On his 43rd birthday, Gallo sat down for dinner at Umberto's Clam House in Little Italy. The restaurant buzzed with laughter and clinking glasses until gunmen burst through the door. Gallo was shot multiple times in front of his family and guests, staggering onto the street before collapsing. Blood pooled on the cobblestones beneath the neon sign. New York watched in horror as one of its most infamous gangsters died in public under the same lights that once celebrated him. The violence didn't stop there. It spread to Chicago, Philadelphia, and beyond. In Chicago, the outfit continued to enforce its will with terrifying precision. Those who crossed the mob disappeared. In 1957, Tony "the Ant" Spilotro, a ruthless enforcer, brought the outfit's reign to Las Vegas, ensuring no casino profits escaped mafia control. Spilotro's methods were legendary for their cruelty: torture, acid baths, and untraceable burials in the desert sands. The Las Vegas Strip glittered for tourists, but underneath the casinos lay a graveyard of those who had defied the mob's rules. But even as violence raged, the mafia's downfall was quietly being engineered by its own arrogance. The Appalachian Meeting of 1957 had already exposed the national network of organized crime to federal authorities. Now, the FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover's reluctant but growing acknowledgement of the mafia's existence, launched full-scale investigations. Wiretaps, informants, and surveillance replaced the naive denials of the past. The Code of Omerta, the sacred vow of silence, was being tested like never before. Some members began to break, facing life sentences or execution. A few dared to do the unthinkable: talk. In 1963, Joseph Valachi, a low-level soldier in the Genovese family, became the first mafia member to publicly testify before Congress. His words tore through the underworld like a bomb. Valachi revealed the mafia's structure, rituals, and internal hierarchy, exposing names and operations that law enforcement had never confirmed. For the first time, the Cosa Nostra wasn't a myth. It was a documented institution. Valachi's testimony marked the beginning of a war not between families, but between the mafia and the United States government. Yet, even with arrests mounting, violence escalated. The mafia was cornered, and cornered beasts fight hardest. In 1979, Carmine Galante, the Bonanno family boss known for his ruthless expansion of the heroin trade, was gunned down while eating lunch on a sunny afternoon in Brooklyn. His killers left his cigar still burning between his teeth, a final insult to a man who thought himself untouchable. In 1985, Paul Castellano, head of the Gambino family, was shot dead outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan, a hit orchestrated by his ambitious underboss, John Gotti. The murder, carried out in broad daylight on one of the city's busiest streets, became an international headline. It wasn't just another killing. It was the public execution of the old mafia order. With Castellano's death, Gotti rose to power, flamboyant, charismatic, and reckless. Dubbed the Dapper Don by the media for his expensive suits and confident grin, he became the face of organized crime in the modern era. But his fame was his curse. Gotti's arrogance invited scrutiny, and by the early 1990s, the FBI had enough evidence, including wiretaps recorded by his own underboss, Sammy the Bull Gravano, to bring him down. When Gravano broke Omerta and testified against Gotti, it marked the final betrayal in a century built on betrayal. The king of the streets was finally caged. The era of blood had burned itself out, leaving behind a trail of corpses, widows, and broken codes. The mafia, once a symbol of power and fear, was now bleeding from within. Its leaders were dead or imprisoned, its soldiers scattered, its code shattered. The streets that once trembled under the weight of their rule now whispered their decline. But the mafia never truly died. It simply adapted. Its guns grew quieter, its crimes more sophisticated, its influence harder to trace. The blood in the streets faded, but the shadow remained. Because, as history would soon reveal, you can kill men, but you cannot kill power. Power evolves. And in America, the Cosa Nostra had already learned how to wear a new disguise: legitimacy. By the early 1990s, the American mafia, once the invisible hand that controlled cities, unions, and governments, was facing extinction. Its leaders were dead or imprisoned, its code of silence shattered by betrayal, and its influence steadily eroded by a new enemy it could not intimidate: technology and surveillance. The same secrecy that had protected it for nearly a century was now impossible to maintain. Hidden cameras, wiretaps, and undercover agents penetrated what had once been an impenetrable brotherhood. For the first time since its birth, the Cosa Nostra was no longer feared. It was being hunted. The fall began quietly, through voices that should never have spoken. Men who once swore oaths on saints and guns began to trade loyalty for freedom. The FBI had learned that the mafia's greatest strength, its reliance on human loyalty, was also its greatest weakness. When one man talked, others followed, and once the walls of silence cracked, they crumbled fast. Sammy the Bull Gravano was one of them. The underboss of the Gambino family, Gravano had helped orchestrate some of the mafia's most high-profile murders, including the execution of Paul Castellano. But when the government turned its attention to John Gotti, the Teflon Don, who had become a celebrity criminal, Gravano made a choice that stunned the underworld. Facing life in prison, he turned informant, providing the FBI with the evidence that would finally convict Gotti in 1992. The trial ended an era. The once feared boss, who strutted through Manhattan in $1,000 suits, now sat behind bars, silenced by the very man who had once sworn to protect him. Gotti's conviction was more than a victory for the law. It was a symbol. The mafia, for all its power, was not untouchable anymore. From New York to Chicago, the dominoes began to fall. Long-standing figures like Tony Dux Corallo, Vincent the Chin Gigante, and Joseph Massino, men who had ruled their families with iron fists, were taken down one by one. Each conviction peeled away a layer of the mafia's mystique. The streets that once trembled under its control grew bolder. Journalists wrote openly about mob trials. Former hitmen appeared on talk shows. Hollywood turned their stories into entertainment. What was once sacred and secret had become spectacle. The mafia, once a myth shrouded in fear, was now a public fascination. But behind the headlines and convictions, something more subtle was happening. The mafia wasn't dying. It was transforming. When the FBI dismantled its old power structures, the organization learned to adapt. No longer dependent on the flashy violence of the past, it evolved into something quieter, more invisible. Its new operations focused on white-collar crime, stock manipulation, real estate fraud, loan sharking through legitimate companies. The suits stayed, but the blood was gone. Instead of guns, they used accountants. Instead of street wars, they waged financial ones. Las Vegas, once the mafia's crown jewel, became the symbol of this transformation. Federal crackdowns had driven mob influence out of the casinos by the late 1980s, but the financial empire they built remained. Many of the corporations that took over the Strip were indirectly born from mob-funded construction and laundering networks. In a cruel irony, the mafia's dream had come true. Las Vegas had become the empire they envisioned, only now it was legal. The money flowed just the same, only through cleaner hands. The mob didn't lose the war, it simply lost its name. Still, some couldn't let go of the old ways. In the 2000s, sporadic acts of violence reminded the world that the mafia wasn't completely gone. Car bombings in Brooklyn, mysterious disappearances in Chicago, and whispers of revenge in New Jersey kept the legend alive. Yet these were remnants of a bygone age, echoes of an empire that no longer ruled but refused to vanish. Federal investigations like Operation Donnie Brasco and Operation Family Secrets revealed that the organization still existed, though fractured and diminished. The mafia had become a ghost, not seen, but never truly gone. Perhaps the most chilling truth of all was that the mafia's influence had not disappeared. It had simply become unrecognizable. Where the old dons once ruled through violence, new players operated through respectability. Corporate executives, bankers, lobbyists. The modern underworld wore ties instead of trench coats. The crimes were the same: extortion, fraud, manipulation. Only the stage had changed. The mafia had evolved into the very system it once infiltrated. In 2011, when the FBI launched one of its largest mafia crackdowns in history, arresting over 120 suspected members across multiple states, many observers declared it the final death of La Cosa Nostra. But those who understood its history knew better. The mafia was never just an organization. It was a philosophy, a code of power, profit, and silence. It thrived not because of its members, but because of the conditions that allowed it to exist: inequality, greed, corruption, and the eternal hunger for control. As long as those forces lived, the mafia's spirit would never truly die. Even in Italy, where the Sicilian Cosa Nostra and Calabrian 'Ndrangheta continued to dominate, the American branch maintained quiet connections. Money laundering, drug routes, and offshore networks linked both continents like veins of the same beast. The names changed, the faces aged, but the purpose remained: profit through power. And just like in the early 1900s, when poor Sicilian immigrants brought the Code of Omertà to New York, the same code endured, just rewritten in the language of global capitalism. By the 2020s, the mafia no longer looked like the headlines of the past. It wasn't the man with the fedora whispering in a smoky bar. It was the businessman negotiating a deal in a glass skyscraper. Its power was less visible but no less real. The empire of terror had become an empire of influence, where control was exercised not through bullets, but through contracts, lobbying, and digital transactions. The shadow of the mafia still stretched across America, only now it was hidden behind corporate names and political donations. And yet, for all its evolution, the mythology of the mafia remains indestructible. Movies, documentaries, and books continue to romanticize its legacy: the loyalty, the codes, the rise and fall of men who built empires from nothing. But beneath the legend lies a darker truth. The mafia's story is not one of honor, but of manipulation, corruption, and fear. It mirrors America itself, a nation built on ambition, driven by power, and haunted by the ghosts of those who dared to control it. The fall of the mafia was never absolute. It was transformation disguised as defeat. The empire that once ruled through terror now thrives in silence. Its soldiers may no longer carry guns, but its influence still bleeds into the cracks of modern society, hidden in boardrooms, courts, and campaign funds. And like every great empire in history, it didn't vanish. It adapted. It survived, because empires don't die in the light. They retreat into the shadows, waiting for the world to forget their shape. And in those shadows, the Cosa Nostra still breathes, silent,